Good evening, my dears. I'm Mrs. Antonia, and I'll be 78 years old in 2025. I was born in 1947 in the countryside of Minas Gerais. But before I begin my story, I'd like to ask those watching to please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It's always a joy to know that my words reach far and wide. I was born in a simple house with whitewashed walls and a dirt floor, back when electricity was still a luxury in the small towns of the interior. We were 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. But from an early age, it was clear that there was a glaring difference in how my mother, Mrs. Sebastiana, treated us girls. The boys were the men of the house. From a young age, they got the biggest portions of food, new clothes when needed. And most importantly, they could go to school. Meanwhile, my sister, Mary Carmichael, and I were practically household servants with no rights other than to do the hard work. My mother was a bitter woman. Now that I'm older, I understand she was herself a victim of a strict upbringing in the 1920s, the daughter of a violent father and forced into marriage at 15. But back then, all I felt was fear and confusion. Her brown eyes always seemed to be accusing me of something. I remember as if it were yesterday her rough, calloused hands from working in the fields, which didn't hesitate to punish me for the slightest mistake. Girl, you don't need an education. You need to learn to take care of the house to find a good husband, she would repeat like a mantra, as she forced me to wake up at 4 a.m. to light the wood stove and prepare coffee. By the time I was 8, I was already washing all the family's clothes in the creek, with hands cracked from the lye soap. At 10, I cooked for everyone while my mother worked in the fields. And woe to me if the beans were overcooked or the flour ran out before it should have. The punishments were harsh and frequent. Kneeling on corn kernels for hours, sleeping in the back room with no window, or going days eating only saltless corn mush. But the worst punishment was when she found my hidden notebooks. I had an insatiable hunger for learning. My older brother Joseph, feeling sorry for my situation, would bring me his used notebooks and secretly teach me what he was learning at school. At night, by the light of a lantern while everyone else slept, I copied letters and numbers, memorized lessons, dreaming of a different future. When I was 12 years old, one of the most painful episodes of my childhood happened. I found, hidden in an old shoebox, a yellowed photograph. In it, a young and handsome man smiled next to my mother. On the back it read, Sebastiana and Anthony, 1946. My father had died when I was a baby, or so I had always been told. I never knew much about him, only that he shared the same name they gave me. When my mother saw the photo in my hands, her face completely changed. I will never forget that look, a mix of hatred and panic. It was the only time I saw her totally lose control. She snatched the photo from my hands, tore it into pieces while shouting words that as a child I didn't fully understand. She called me filthy, an intruder, just like your father's bastard. As punishment, she locked me in the dark basement of the house, a damp, windowless room where we stored potatoes and other supplies. I stayed there for 3 whole days, given only a piece of hard bread and a cup of water each day. My siblings tried to intervene, but she threatened to punish them as well. In that dark basement, between tears and fear, I made a promise to myself. One day I would leave that house. One day I would be the master of my own destiny. That moment planted the seed of my liberation, though many years of suffering still lay ahead before I could reap the rewards. As I grew older, the physical punishments lessened, but the hard work and humiliations increased. By the age of 14, while other girls in the neighborhood were preparing for their birthday parties, I was practically a full-time housekeeper. I cooked, cleaned, did laundry, tended the garden, and still had to help in the fields when needed. My sister Mary Carmichael, 2 years younger, had a more submissive nature and seemed to accept that life more easily. She resigned herself to the fate our mother had set. I didn't. Every humiliation, every injustice, fueled an inner fire that refused to be extinguished. Around that time, I began saving small amounts of money. I discovered I had a talent for sewing and secretly started making small repairs for neighbors who paid me a few coins. I used to hide money inside an old shoe at the back of the wardrobe, a little treasure symbolizing the chance to escape. At night, after everyone had fallen asleep, I would take out my hidden notebooks and study by candlelight, using candles I made myself from scraps of tallow. My brother Joseph kept bringing me borrowed books from the school library, literature history, geography. I devoured everything with an insatiable thirst for knowledge. It was in one of those books that I first saw pictures of big cities, universities, and women working as teachers and nurses. That opened up a whole new world for me. There were possibilities beyond that life of submission and hard labor. There was a potential future where I could be more than just Sebastiana's daughter, more than a wife and mother. But my mother seemed to have a sixth sense for detecting anything that could give me hope. One Sunday afternoon, while she was visiting a friend, I was so absorbed in reading a book of poetry that I didn't hear her footsteps returning. When I finally noticed, she was already at the door, her eyes flashing with anger. The book was snatched from my hands and thrown straight into the wood stove. That's the devil's work. Books are only good for putting worms in a woman's head, she shouted, as I helplessly watched the pages turn to ashes. That day, the punishment wasn't just physical. Something worse happened. She found and burned all my notebooks, carefully hidden for years. It was the first time I felt like I couldn't endure it anymore. The first time running away became more than just a distant dream. I was almost 16 years old and felt like every day in that house was another day of my life being stolen. But fate still had more challenges in store before I could finally break free. At 17, I discovered the true reason behind my mother's hatred toward me. It was also when I realized I had to escape that house to survive. January of 1964 was especially hot in the countryside of Minas Gerais. Breakfast was already ready when Aunt Lourdes, my mother's sister, unexpectedly arrived from the capital. Aunt Lourdes was the only person in the family who showed me kindness. Whenever she visited us, she brought small gifts hidden in her bag, a hair ribbon, a scented soap, simple little things that were priceless to me. My mother didn't like these visits, but she couldn't stop them. Aunt Lourdes was a widow of a successful merchant and helped our family financially during tough times. But on that day, something felt different. The two of them locked themselves in the living room while we, the children, were sent outside. I stayed in the yard, pretending to sweep the dry leaves, but actually, I positioned myself strategically near the half-open window of the living room. That's when I heard the words that changed everything. "Sebastiana, for God's sake, the girl is old enough. Antonia deserves to know the truth about her father." The truth? My mother spat the word out. The truth is that that bastard abandoned me while I was pregnant to run off with the colonel's daughter. The shame I endured in this town, everyone knew it except for me, who was made to feel like a fool dreaming of marriage. And then I had to carry this girl who is his spitting image. Every time I look at her face, it's him I see humiliating me. I was frozen, my heart pounding so loud I thought they might hear it. So that's why. I wasn't the daughter of the man my mother later introduced as my father, the one who died when I was a baby. I was the product of a love that ended in abandonment and humiliation, and that's why you punished the girl for a man's guilt. Sebastiana, look at what you're doing. Antonia is smart and hardworking. She could have a different future. A future? What future? To end up like me, deceived, abandoned, pregnant. No, it's better for her to stay here under my watch, learning that a woman's place is in the home. At least this way, she won't bring shame upon herself out there. I couldn't bear to listen any longer. I stepped away from the window, my legs trembling, a storm of emotions consuming me. Anger, sadness, disappointment, but also, strangely, a sense of relief. I finally understood. I wasn't the problem. I never was. It was the ghost of a man I never knew, a pain my mother never overcame and decided to pass on to me. That night, after everyone had fallen asleep, Aunt Lourdes came to the little room at the back where I slept. Without saying a word, she handed me a sealed envelope. "Only open it when you are alone, my daughter, and know that there will always be a place for you in my home in Belo Horizonte." I waited until I was absolutely sure nobody else was awake. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope. Inside was a letter written in elegant handwriting, very different from my mother's simple and clumsy script. It was dated May 1947, 3 months before I was born. "My dear Sebastiana, I write this letter with a heavy heart full of remorse. I know words cannot undo the harm I have caused, but you need to know the truth. I did not run away with Margaret, the colonel's daughter, by choice. I was threatened with death. The colonel found out about us, about the baby you're expecting, and gave me an ultimatum. Either I marry his daughter, whom I impregnated in a moment of weakness, or my entire family would suffer the consequences. Do you know the power the colonel holds in these lands? I had no choice. I know this doesn't lessen your pain or justify my abandonment, but I want you to know that I will love you and our child forever, even from afar. I'm leaving all the money I managed to gather with your sister lords. It's not much, but I hope it helps you and our child have a better life. I'm sorry for my cowardice. I'm sorry for not being the man you deserved. With eternal love, Anthony. Along with the letter was a small photograph, the same one I had found years before that had led to my punishment in the basement. It was my biological father, and as my mother had said, I really did look a lot like him. The same green eyes, the same face shape. I cried silently until dawn. They were not just tears of sadness, but of resolve. That letter changed everything. My father hadn't simply abandoned my mother. He had been forced to choose between her and his family's safety. He was not the monster I had imagined for so many years. More importantly, that letter showed me I was not a mistake, a shame, as my mother had always made me believe. I was the product of true love, even if it ended in tragedy. The next morning, Aunt Lourdes left, promising to return in 2 months. Before leaving, she managed to have a moment alone with me while I was washing clothes in the trough. Antonia, I have already spoken with your mother. I will take you with me on my next visit to spend some time in Belo Horizonte, I told her, hoping she could help me with the household chores as I was getting older. Just hold on a little longer, my daughter. Those words sparked a hope in me that I had never felt before. 2 months. I only had to endure 2 more months in that house, but fate had other plans. A week after Aunt Lourdes left, my mother called me into the living room after dinner. Her expression was more serious than usual. I got a letter today from Mr. Juvenal. Julian Perry was the oldest and wealthiest man in the region, a widower over 50 with 5 grown children and a terrible reputation for drinking and being harsh. Everyone in town knew the stories of how badly he treated his late wife. He's looking for a new wife. He's offering a good dowry land and some cattle. I told him you were available. I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. An arranged marriage. That was the future my mother had planned for me. But Mom, he's old enough to be my grandfather. The slap came swift and hard, burning my cheek. Since when does my daughter get to choose? It's a good opportunity. You'll go to a big house with land with comfort. The deal is already made. The wedding is next month. That night, I couldn't sleep. The thought of marrying Julian Perry was worse than any punishment I'd ever faced. Everyone knew of his cruelty, his brutality. I realized that if this marriage happened, I'd be trading one prison for another, an even worse one. That's when I made my decision. I wouldn't wait 2 months for Aunt Lourdes to come back. I had to act immediately. The next day, under the pretense of going to the market, I found a moment alone. I ran to the post office and sent an urgent telegram to Aunt Lourdes, telling her about the arranged marriage. On my way back, I stopped at the house of my only friend, Conceição, the shoemaker's daughter. I have to escape, Conceição. My mother wants to marry me off to Julian Perry. Conceição's face went pale. She knew all too well the stories about that man. When? Tonight. I need to be far away before she officially announces the engagement on Sunday at Mass. Conceição, always loyal, didn't hesitate. She packed a small bundle with some simple clothes she could lend me. She also gave me some coins she had secretly been saving from her father. It wasn't much, but along with my savings from years of secret sewing, it might be enough to get to Belo Horizonte. The plan was simple and desperate. Wait until everyone was asleep, gather my few belongings and my father's letter, and slip away quietly in the night. I intended to hitch a ride to the nearest big town, and from there catch a bus to Belo Horizonte. At that moment, I realized I was about to leave behind everything I knew, that I might never see my brothers again, especially Joseph, who had helped me so much. But I also knew it was my only chance to survive. What I didn't realize was that this nighttime escape was just the beginning of a much longer and harder journey than I could have imagined, and that years later I would return to that same house, no longer the frightened girl I once was, but a completely transformed woman. Running away from home was the hardest yet most freeing decision of my life. On that night in February 1964, just 17 years old, carrying a small bundle of clothes and some savings hidden in the lining of my dress, I left behind the only life I'd ever known. The plan didn't go as smoothly as I expected. I managed to get a ride with a truck driver to the neighboring town, but learned that the next bus to Belo Horizonte wouldn't leave until the next morning. I spent the most terrifying night of my life hiding in the small bus station, trembling with fear and cold, imagining any moment my mother would show up with Julian Perry to drag me back. When I finally arrived in Belo Horizonte after nearly 12 hours on an old rattling bus, I felt completely lost. The big city swallowed me whole. So many people, so many buildings, so much noise. I, who had never left the countryside, felt like I'd landed on another planet. Finding Aunt Lourdes' house was another challenge. I had the address written down, but had no idea how to navigate that maze of streets. After wandering for hours, lost and scared, I spent almost all my money on a taxi. The look on Aunt Lourdes' face when she opened the door and saw me there, dirty from the journey, with dark circles under my eyes and trembling with nerves, was one of utter shock. She had only received my telegram that morning. "My God, Antonia, how did you get here all alone?" I broke down in tears in her arms. For the first time in my life, I experienced what it truly meant to be welcomed, without judgment and without conditions. We spent that entire night talking. I shared everything. The discovery about my father, the arranged marriage, my desperate escape. Aunt Lourdes cried with me. She apologized for not intervening sooner, for not having taken me out of that house years ago. "But now you're here, my daughter, and no one is going to hurt you anymore." The first few months at Aunt Lourdes' house were all about adjusting. Life in the capital was completely different from anything I had known. Everything frightened me: the constant noise of cars, the crowds in the streets, the lights, the different customs. I, who had always woken before sunrise, now had to learn the pace of the big city, where people seemed to stay up later and wake up on a different schedule. But there were also wonders. Electricity in every room, running water, a radio where we could listen to music and news from all over the country, and the most surprising thing for me, books. Aunt Lourdes had a small shelf filled with novels, encyclopedias, and poetry books. For the first time in my life, I could read without the fear of being punished. A week after I arrived, a letter from my mother showed up, addressed to Aunt Lourdes. Not a single word was for me, only demands to send me back immediately, threats to call the police for kidnapping a minor, accusations that I had stolen money before running away. Aunt Lourdes firmly replied that I would remain in her care, that she would take full responsibility for me, and if necessary, she would take the case to court to prove the abuse I had endured over the years. We never heard from her again. Years later, through one of my siblings, I learned that my mother had publicly burned Aunt Lourdes' letter and forbidden any mention of my name in that house. For all intents and purposes, I had died that February night. Living with Aunt Lourdes showed me a side of the world I had never known. A home where there were no screams or physical punishments, where there was dialogue, respect, and even affection. She encouraged me to go back to school. "You have a gifted mind, Antonia. It would be a waste not to study." Returning to school at 17 in a class full of younger students was awkward at first. But my hunger for knowledge outweighed any embarrassment. I studied twice as hard to make up for lost years. The nights were long over the books, but unlike before, I could now turn on a lamp to read without fear of being discovered. Brazil was going through tumultuous times that year. As I fought to rebuild my life, the country was under a military coup. The news on the radio was confusing and frightening. Aunt Lourdes, who had some friends involved in politics, started to worry. Belo Horizonte, which already seemed large to my eyes, suddenly felt too small to protect us. That's when the opportunity that would change our lives presented itself. An old friend of Aunt Lourdes' late husband offered her a job in São Paulo at a newly opened department store. For me, he offered a position as a sewing apprentice. São Paulo meant a fresh start, the chance to put even more distance from the past that haunted us. In July 1964, we boarded a train to São Paulo, leaving behind Belo Horizonte and any trace that could lead my mother or Julian Perry to us. I remember looking out the train window as the mountains of Minas faded into the horizon, feeling a mix of relief and melancholy. São Paulo was a completely different world. The gigantic city intimidated me in the first few days. So many cars, so many tall buildings, people from all over Brazil, and even from other countries. We rented a small apartment in the Bra neighborhood, close to the center and the factories where we worked. My job at the department store started simply, making small adjustments to customers' clothes. But soon, my skill with the needle caught attention. The manager of the women's clothing section, an Italian gentleman named Giacomo, noticed that I had talent not just for mending, but also for creating. The girl has a good eye for cut and color. Have you ever thought about designing models? No, I had never thought about it. In fact, I had never considered that my hands, trained by necessity since childhood, could create something beautiful, something people would want to buy. The idea seemed absurd at first, but Giacomo insisted, gave me scraps of fabric that would have been discarded, and encouraged me to try. In my spare time, I began drawing simple designs, adaptations of dresses I saw in the fashion magazines that circulated through the store. Meanwhile, I continued studying at night. Aunt Lourdes always insisted that education was the only path to true independence. In early 1966, at 19 years old, I finally finished junior high and enrolled in night school. My days were exhausting. I worked 10 hours at the store, studied at night, and still made time for my little sewing projects. It was in September of that year that I met Robert, a young accountant who worked at the store's office. Unlike any man I had met before, Robert was kind, respectful, and encouraging. Soon we started dating, always under Aunt Lourdes's watchful eyes. "This boy seems decent, Antonia, but take it slow. A man often seems sweet at first, then shows his true colors." I understood Aunt Lourdes's concern. After all, she knew my mother's story well. She knew how a man could ruin a woman's life. But Robert turned out to be different day by day. He respected my dreams, my work, and my studies. He said he admired my determination. At the beginning of 1967, something unexpected happened. Since I was on medical leave, I was temporarily promoted to assistant in the women's section. An important client needed a dress for a gala event, and no one could satisfy her. In a bold moment, I showed her one of my designs. She loved it and insisted I make the dress myself. I worked day and night on that piece. When she tried on the finished dress, her tears of joy confirmed that I had found my true talent. Not only did she pay me well for the dress, but she also recommended me to her friends in São Paulo's high society. Within a few months, I had so many private orders that I had to decide, stay at the store or risk starting my own business. Robert, who was already talking about marriage, encouraged me. "You have talent, Antonia, and you have courage. What more do you need?" I needed startup capital, something that seemed impossible for a former runaway from the countryside of Minas. But Aunt Lourdes, always my guardian angel, had saved money all those years. Money I then learned came from the sale of a small piece of land my biological father had left me. "Your father wanted a different future for you, Antonia. Use this money to make your dream come true. It's the least he could do for you." In August 1967, just after turning 20, I rented a small space in downtown São Paulo and opened the Antonia studio. The beginning was tough, like any new venture, but my talent combined with recommendations from the first satisfied clients soon turned that small space into a go-to spot for women looking for exclusive, well-crafted pieces. In December of that same year, Robert proposed to me. Getting married meant many things to me: security, companionship, the chance to build the loving family I never had, but it also brought deep fears. What if Robert changed after we married? What if I ended up like my mother, bitter, violent, destroyed by a man? I shared these fears with him one starry night by the banks of the Tietê River, which wasn't as polluted back then. Robert listened to every word without interrupting, holding my trembling hands. "Antonia, I can't promise I'll be perfect, but I promise I will never ever try to diminish who you are, your talent, your strength, your determination." That's when I fell in love. We got married in March 1968 in a simple ceremony. My wish was for my siblings to be there, especially Joseph, who had helped me so much. I sent out invitations, but none of them came. The fear of facing our mother was stronger than the love they had for me. I understood, but silently carried that pain. Our married life began in a small apartment near my studio. Robert kept working as an accountant and also took care of the finances for my growing business. Aunt Lourdes moved in with us when her health started to decline in early 1969. It was at that moment, when I finally felt I'd found my place in the world, that a telegram arrived and reopened all the wounds of the past. My mother was seriously ill. Joseph was asking me to come back to Minas to see her one last time. The past I had tried so hard to leave behind was knocking at my door again, and I had to decide if I had the courage to face it. That telegram left me paralyzed for days. My mother, on the brink of death, wanted to see me. The same woman who had mistreated me for years, who planned to sell me into a forced marriage, who tore up my family photo and erased me from her life, was now calling me for a final goodbye. Robert and Aunt Lourdes respected my silence as I absorbed the news. They didn't offer opinions, nor did they pressure me. They understood that the decision had to be mine alone. After a week of deep reflection, I decided to go. Not for forgiveness or reconciliation. I owed her nothing. I was going to close that chapter of my life to look into the eyes of the woman who tormented me and show her that I had survived, that I had built a worthy life despite her, not because of her. "I'll go with you, Antonia," Robert said, worried about how that reunion might affect me. "No, this is something I need to do alone." On a gray morning in July 1969, I boarded the bus to Minas Gerais. The trip back to that small town felt strangely longer than the escape 5 years before. Every kilometer traveled pulled me back to the past I had fought so hard to leave behind. When I stepped off at the dusty bus station, I felt the weight of the stairs. I was no longer the fragile, frightened Antonia who had run away on a February night. I was returning as a 22-year-old woman, well-dressed, confident, the master of my own destiny. The whispers followed me down the main street. "It's Sebastiana's daughter, the one who ran away. Look how elegant she is. They say she got rich in São Paulo." The house was just as I remembered it. Whitewashed adobe walls, a worn roof, a yard where chickens scratched the earth. But it seemed smaller, less imposing. Or maybe it was me who had grown stronger. Joseph waited for me at the door. My brother, once a fragile young boy, was now almost 30, with thinning hair and weary eyes. We embraced without words, our tears speaking for us. "She's very ill, Antonia. The doctor says it's only a matter of days." I entered the darkened room where my mother was fading away. The smell of illness and medicine was overwhelming. It took me a few seconds to recognize in that skeletal, yellowed figure the strong and stern woman who haunted my nightmares. Sebastiana at 56 looked more like she was 80. Cancer was devouring her from within, more merciless than the hatred she had carried for so many years. Her eyes opened when I approached the bed. For a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition, followed by something I had never seen in those eyes before: vulnerability. "You came?" The voice was just a whisper, so different from the screams that marked my childhood. "I came," I replied shortly. We stayed silent for a long time. What do you say to a woman who is dying but who also tormented you for years? What words could hold all the pain, all the anger, all the fear? It was she who broke the silence. "Are you okay in São Paulo?" "I am. I have my own sewing studio. I'm married to a good man. Aunt Lourdes lives with us." A bitter smile twisted her dry lips. "Lourdes always meddling where she shouldn't. She saved my life, and I tried to ruin hers. Is that what you came to tell me?" I was struck by her clarity, by how plainly she faced her own actions. I expected denial, excuses, not this raw acceptance. "I didn't come to say anything. I came to see for myself." "See what, Antonia? See that the cycle has been broken, that I won't be like you?" Silent tears rolled down my mother's wrinkled face. They weren't tears of regret. I knew that woman too well to believe she could feel remorse. They were tears of recognition, realizing that in the end I had won. "This house, the land, everything will be yours when I'm gone. It's your inheritance." I let out a humorless laugh. "I don't want anything from here. You can leave everything to my brothers. They already have their lives." Joseph married the blacksmith's daughter and lives in Belo Horizonte. The others are scattered. "This land always belonged to you by right." "And by right? What right did I have in this house other than—" "Being your slave? What right did I have other than being beaten and humiliated? What right other than almost being sold like cattle to Julian Perry? My voice rose, years of pain pouring out all at once. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She simply took it in as one accepts an undeniable truth. Julian Perry died last year, drinking as always. He crashed his car coming back from town. The news should have brought me some relief, but I felt nothing. That man who haunted my nightmares for years was just another shadow of the past. You have every right to hate me, Antonia. I don't ask for forgiveness. I just ask that you accept what is yours. Something in her tone, not a plea, but a strange kind of justice, made me hesitate. It was no longer about material inheritance. It was something deeper, more symbolic. I'll think about it, I finally replied. I spent 3 days in that house, going back and forth between my dying mother's room and long walks around the property. I revisited every corner, the basement where I was punished, the creek where I washed clothes until my hands bled, the spot behind the hose where I'd hide to read in secret. Each place held painful memories, but it also showed me how far I had come. On the morning of the 4th day, Sebastiana passed away peacefully in her sleep. There was no dramatic reconciliation, no last-minute forgiveness, just the quiet dignity of two women who, each in their own way, accepted the end of a long struggle. The burial was simple and brief. Few neighbors attended. My mother had never been well liked in the community. As the coffin was lowered into the ground, I felt a strange lightness, as if a huge weight had been lifted from my shoulders. After the burial, the town clerk contacted me with the will. It was true. My mother had left the house and land solely to me. My siblings inherited only small personal keepsakes. She wrote this 2 months ago after learning how serious her illness was, the clerk explained. He insisted it be carried out exactly as written. I returned to the house, now officially mine, and sat alone on the porch, staring at that small piece of land that had been my personal hell for so many years. What should I do with it? Selling would be the most logical option. Take the money and never look back. But as I watched the sunset behind the mountains, an idea started to form in my mind, an idea that grew throughout the night and by morning had become a decision. I called Robert from a payphone in town. I'm going to stay a few more days, love. I have something important to do here. The following week, I used part of my savings from the workshop to hire a small construction crew. The project was simple but meaningful. The old house would be completely renovated and turned into a sewing and crafts school for girls and women in the area. Anthony Noguera School of Arts and Crafts. Using the name of my biological father from Fronespizio was my small act of personal revenge, but also a tribute to the man who, although absent, had wished for a better future for me. I returned to São Paulo to get my life in order. Robert, ever supportive, fully backed my plan. Aunt Lourdes, now elderly and unwell, wept when she heard about my intentions. You're better than all of us, Antonia, turning pain into something so beautiful. Your father would be so proud. Over the next few months, I traveled regularly between São Paulo and Minas. The workshop in São Paulo stayed under my care, but now I had a new mission. The school quickly took shape. I hired local teachers, bought sewing machines and teaching materials, and set up a scholarship program so girls from poor families could study for free. In January 1970, 6 months after my mother's passing, we officially opened the school. The small town had never seen anything like it. Women and girls from all around signed up for courses in sewing, embroidery, and various crafts. The room that had been my mother's became a library, floor-to-ceiling shelves filled with books on art, history, and literature, all available to any student wanting to expand her horizons beyond crafts. In the very spot where I endured my harshest punishment, the dark basement, we created the brightest, most airy room in the school with large windows that let in constant light. It became the main workshop where the advanced students crafted their pieces. For many young women in the region, the school was the only chance to learn a trade, gain financial independence, and break free from arranged marriages or lives restricted to domestic work. Exactly what I had never had the chance to do at their age. I watched young women transform before my eyes, gaining confidence and discovering talents they never knew they had. Some went on to technical courses in larger cities. Others started small businesses locally. They all carried the certainty that they could be more than just another link in the chain of submission. In 1972, when the school was thriving, I received an unexpected visitor. Margaret, the colonel's daughter, the woman for whom my biological father had been forced to leave my mother. She was an elegant, middle-aged woman with the same sad eyes I saw in the mirror every day. "I came to meet Anthony's daughter," she said simply. We talked for hours. I discovered that her marriage to my father had been as unhappy as it was forced. My father died of pneumonia in 1958, never recovering from the depression caused by having abandoned my mother, who herself lived for years burdened with the guilt of an arrangement she did not choose. Your father never stopped thinking about you even without knowing you. In his final days, delirious with fever, he called for my little girl in Minas. That visit brought a strange comfort, as if a long-lost piece of my life's puzzle had finally found its place. But the true sense of victory of complete revenge came a few months later when an elderly lady enrolled in the evening classes at the school. She was the widow of Julian Perry. After her violent husband's death, she had fallen into poverty. The children sold everything, leaving her almost homeless. Now, at 70 years old, she sought to learn a trade to support herself. I remember the day she walked into my office, trembling and ashamed. "You won't accept me once you find out who I am." "I know exactly who you are, Mrs. Eulalia, and it's precisely for that reason you will receive a full scholarship and all the support you need." The surprise on her face spoke louder than 1,000 words. There I was, the girl who had nearly been given to her abusive husband as a slave wife, now transformed into her benefactor. In that moment, I understood the true meaning of revenge. It wasn't about making others suffer as I had suffered. It was about breaking the cycle of suffering entirely, transforming pain into strength, trauma into healing, hatred into purpose. The Anthony Nogueira School of Arts and Crafts became my greatest legacy, bigger than the studio in São Paulo, bigger than any dress I ever created, because through it, hundreds of girls were given the chance that I had been denied, the chance to choose their own path. And that, my dear ones, was the sweetest revenge I could have. The years passed like pages in a book flipping quickly. From 1972 until today, so much has changed in the world, in Brazil, and in my life. But some things have remained constant. My determination, my commitment to female independence, and the school, which became my greatest pride. The 1970s were a time of intense growth, both for the studio in São Paulo and for the school in Minas. While the country experienced the so-called economic miracle, I cautiously and persistently expanded my business. Robert, always my biggest supporter, quit his job as an accountant to fully dedicate himself to managing our ventures. In 1974, at the age of 27, I received news that would change my life once again. I was pregnant. The thought of becoming a mother filled me with joy, but also brought a deep fear. How would I be as a mother, given the example I had? Would I be able to break that cycle too? "You are not your mother, Antonia," Aunt Lourdes told me when I shared my anxieties. "You are the woman you've chosen to be, despite her." My daughter Helen was born in February 1975, bringing an even brighter light into our lives. Looking at that newborn face, I vowed that she would never know the kind of childhood I had. She would be raised with love, respect, and all the opportunities I never had. 2 years later, in 1977, my son Charles was born. Our family was complete. Balancing motherhood with business was a challenge, but we had the support of Aunt Lourdes, who, though elderly, loved caring for her great-grandchildren while I worked. The Anthony Nogueira School of Arts and Crafts was growing beyond my expectations. What began as a place to learn sewing and handicrafts soon expanded to include basic administration courses, accounting, and even labor law classes. We wanted our students not only to learn a trade, but to have all the tools to be truly independent. In 1978, we had our first student accepted into university. Mary Dolores, daughter of a local farmer, earned a spot in the economics program in Belo Horizonte. She was the first of many. We created a scholarship fund to financially support young women who wanted to pursue higher education. The end of the 1970s also brought losses. Aunt Lourdes, my guardian angel, passed away peacefully in her bed in 1979 at the age of 84. With her, my last link to the past was gone. She was the only person who knew my story from the beginning, who had witnessed my entire journey. "You are my true family." Those were her last words to me, Robert, and the children. Losing you, Lourdes, was like losing a mother. The mother I never had biologically, but whom fate placed in my path. In her honor, we established the Lourdes Noguera Library at the school, a space even larger and more comprehensive than the previous one, with a special focus on books written by women. The 1980s brought new challenges and growth. Brazil was gradually moving toward redemocratization, and women were gaining increasing space in society. My studio in São Paulo had become a reference in quality women's fashion. I no longer sewed every piece myself. I had a team of talented seamstresses, many of whom were trained at our school in Minas. In 1983, I made a bold decision. I opened a branch of the school in São Paulo, in a neighborhood on the city's outskirts. The goal remained the same: to provide women with the tools to achieve financial and personal independence through education and work. The difference was that in the capital, we faced other challenges: migrant women from the Northeast, single mothers from low-income communities, young women who needed to work and study at the same time. Helen and Charles grew up as happy and secure children, so different from the scared girl I once was. From an early age, Helen showed interest in my work with schools, always accompanying me on trips to Minas, talking with students and helping in classes. Charles, more like his father, had a natural talent for numbers and management. "You built an empire from nothing, Mom," Helen once said to me as a teenager. "It's incredible to think it all started with a girl running away in the middle of the night." It was around this time, in the mid-1980s, that I decided my story could not be lost to time. I began documenting everything: my difficult childhood, my relationship with my mother, the escape, the years of struggle, the creation of the school, not to publish, not to seek recognition, but to leave a legacy for future generations of my family, and especially for the women who would pass through our school. In 1989, as the Berlin Wall was coming down on the other side of the world, and Brazil was holding its first direct presidential election in decades, we reached registration number 5,000 at the Anthony Noguera School of Arts and Crafts. 5,000 women who passed through our classrooms, learned a trade, and had the chance to rewrite their own stories. The 1990s marked the international expansion of our work. Helen, having graduated in administration and fashion, took over the management of the atelier in São Paulo, modernizing it and opening the doors to the international market. Our pieces, always with that artisanal touch I learned as a child, began to be featured in fashion shows in Paris and Milan. Charles, who graduated in economics, took charge of the financial management of the entire group, which now included the original atelier, 3 owned stores, a school in Minas, and a branch in São Paulo. Robert, now with gray hair, stayed by my side, more as an advisor than as an active manager. In 1997, at the age of 50, I was diagnosed with breast cancer. Ironically, it was the same disease that took my biological mother. The diagnosis hit me like a bucket of cold water, bringing old fears to the surface. Would this be the end of my story? Would everything I had built come to an end like this? "You've faced worse things, Mom," Helen told me during a chemotherapy session. "This is just another battle you'll win." And I did win. After a year of intensive treatment, I was declared in remission. The experience with cancer transformed me once again. If before I had a sense of urgency to build to prove my worth, now I felt an urgency to share, to ensure that what I built would outlive me. It was then, in the early 2000s, that we officially transformed our schools into a nonprofit foundation, the Anthony Noguera Foundation for Women's Empowerment. With legal status as a philanthropic organization, we secured partnerships with companies, governments, and international organizations, further expanding our reach. In 2002, we opened our 3rd location, this time in the Northeast, a region long plagued by alarming rates of poverty and gender inequality. In 2005, we launched our first microcredit program, enabling former students to start their own small businesses. Robert passed away in 2010 at the age of 67 from a sudden heart attack. Losing him felt like losing a part of myself. We had built together not just a family, but a whole legacy. He was the man who showed me that not all men are like those who negatively impacted my childhood. He was the one who never doubted my ability, always encouraging me to go further. "Keep the story going, Antonia," he once told me. "When it all began with you, it was just a chapter. Now it's a whole book." In the years following Robert's passing, I immersed myself even more deeply in the foundation's work. Helen fully took over the fashion business, turning it into a respected international brand, always maintaining that handcrafted touch that was our signature. Charles expanded the financial sector, creating specific credit lines for women entrepreneurs. In 2015, at the age of 68, I received surprising news. The Ministry of Education had approved our request to transform the foundation into a federal institute of technological education focused on training women for the job market. The old mansion where I endured so much as a child would now officially become a federal educational institution, with funding guaranteed by law. The inauguration of the Anthony Nogueira Federal Institute in 2017 was one of the most moving moments of my life. Seeing that place, once a symbol of pain and oppression, transformed into a modern educational center with computer labs, industrial sewing workshops, and spacious classrooms was more than just vindication. It was redemption. Today, at 78, I look back and see that my life has come full circle. The frightened girl who ran away with a bundle of clothes on a night in February 1964 could never have imagined that one day she would return as the founder of an institution that has changed the lives of over 50,000 women over the decades. I lost touch with my siblings after our mother passed away. I know from others that some have prospered, while others have faced tougher times. Joseph, the only one who truly helped me in childhood, died in 1990 without us ever fully reconciling. It's one of the few wounds I still carry. Helen blessed me with 3 wonderful grandchildren, all now adults and somehow involved in our projects. Charles has 2 sons, also committed to social causes. I take comfort in knowing that the legacy will live on long after I'm gone. If I could go back in time to that frightened girl in the dark basement, I would tell her, hold on. One day, this basement will be a bright classroom where other girls will learn to be free. One day, you will turn all this pain into purpose. The sweetest revenge isn't making others suffer as you did. The sweetest revenge is transforming your suffering into strength and using that strength to make sure others don't have to go through the same. This is my story. A story of abuse, betrayal, abandonment, but also of resilience, transformation, and ultimately triumph. If any part of it touches your heart, if it can inspire even one person to turn their pain into purpose, then it will have been worth sharing. Because in the end, we are all made of the stories we live and the stories we tell. Thank you for listening to my story, my dear friends. Remember, no matter how dark the basement you find yourself in today, there's always the possibility of turning it into a bright room tomorrow. And if you enjoyed my story, don't forget to like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. M.